So why is the aviation community interested in alternative fuels? Well, one really obvious reason is one that all of us have been experiencing for the last decade, which is fuel costs are rising. And for the aviation community over the last decade, fuel costs per gallon have risen by 267%. In fact, fuel costs are now the single largest cost for the airlines beyond labor and benefits and things like that. So they're really interested in finding a way to get a reliable source of fuel that they can have some price stability and have more predictability about what they're going to pay in the future. So that's the business reason for pursuing alternative fuels. But it actually is interesting that the aviation community has also taken on some seriously ambitious environmental goals. The International Air Transport Association has set a goal of 10% alternative fuel use by 2017, and the FAA has set a goal of 1 billion gallons of alternative jet fuel use just here in the US by 2018. Those are some pretty ambitious goals, but what they're aiming for is an even harder goal to achieve, and that is carbon neutral growth. So the idea would be that instead of seeing those emissions increase over the next 40 years, you would see them level off starting in 2020. And the FAA has articulated an even more ambitious goal of carbon neutral growth starting in 2020 at 2005 emissions levels. And the third reason for wanting to have alternative fuels in the aviation community is our regulatory reasons. So the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 in Section 526 said, if you're a federal agency and you purchase fuels for transportation, they can't have a greater carbon footprint than standard petroleum. So that's all includes DOD, so the Air Force, the Navy, they all, when they purchase alternative fuels for transportation, have to be able to say that those fuels have a lower carbon footprint than standard jet fuel. The organization that does qualification of alternative fuels for aviation is the ASTM. So the ASTM is a standard specification producing body. They have the specification that allows you to call, if you meet the specification, you can call it jet fuel. They have recently developed a new specification for alternative jet fuels. And so they established a new methodology for qualifying those fuels. Basically, as you start producing these new fuels, from the point at which you have a few hundred milliliters to the point at which you're making hundreds of thousands of gallons, there are steps along the way where you can test to make sure that your fuel is compatible with the aviation system. Now the question is, okay, we're ready. Are there any fuels? It turns out there's some. And over the last maybe 5 or 6 years, there have been a lot of test flights. There's been a lot of testing of alternative fuel samples. But only in the last 6 months have we really started to see commercial use of alternative fuels. So when it comes to predicting how much fuel there will be and when it will be here and where it will be, there are a number of different things that you have to think about. We need to know about conversion or production capacity. If you have the plant material, who's going to make it into something that's usable as jet fuel or any transportation fuel? You need to think about supply chain development. Who's going to transport this material? How's it going to be distributed? Where is it going to be processed? So pretty much everybody is trying to figure out these questions right now. There are a few different approaches that you can use. A lot of people use what we would call a top-down approach or a feasibility approach, which basically says, if you used absolutely everything that we could conceivably use to make fuels, how much would we get? The next approach is sort of what we would consider a bottom-up approach. It says, well, who's planning on making what? Who's actually, got plans on the ground? What can we expect from the marketplace? And then the other thing that has been tried is a targets approach, where we basically say, well, governments are setting targets like the FAA's 1 billion gallon target. Well, how far does that get us? And actually here at Volpe, we have done all of these things. We have done the feasibility approach, working in collaboration with some folks from MIT and Metron Aviation. We've worked on the market approach, doing a scenario analysis for the CAFE effort, and we've been working on a targets approach with the UN Committee for Aviation and Environmental Protection. So what will the future look like for alternative fuels in aviation? I think one of the big answers is there is no silver bullet. There is no one feedstock. There is no one fuel that is going to answer our question. For biofuels to be part of the transportation fuel solution, we need to go, as the old adage says, think globally and act locally. Personally, in 15 years, I hope we see biofuels as a partial solution or as a bridge to some wonderful alternative that we have not yet identified.